And I'd like to welcome everyone today to our fabulous webinar on women, work and COVID-19, beginning of the end for gender equality. So my name is Lucy-Anne Buckley. I'm a senior lecturer here in the School of Law in NUI Galway and a member of the Whitaker Institute. And I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. And I'm really excited about this because it's just such an important topic. It's one of real concern at the moment. And, you know, obviously COVID-19 is impacting everyone, but there are clear indications that some of this impact is gender specific. And in fact, that some women may be particularly disadvantaged due to cumulative or intersecting factors. The Labour Organisation has warned that COVID-19 could wipe out what they call the modest progress made on gender equality in recent years. But I suppose the question is it really that bad? Are we really seeing the beginning of the end for gender equality? So to begin with, I'd like to introduce our excellent array of speakers for today and welcome them all to the webinar. So we have four really superb speakers. First, we have Joanne Conaghan, who is Professor of Law at the University of Bristol, and she is author of the monograph Law and Gender from OUP in 2013. And Joanne has written extensively about issues of gender and labour, focusing in particular on the ways in which gender features in the social organisation of work and on the legal framework which supports and regulates gendered working arrangements. And Joanne has recently commented on the impact of COVID-19 on gender inequality in the futures of work. We also have Dr. Nata Duberry, who is Senior Lecturer and Director of the Centre for Global Women's Studies, and also the leader of the Gender and Public Policy Cluster in the Whitaker Institute. Nata is an international development expert with more than 25 years of experience in gender development and empowerment. Her work includes research and advocacy on gender-based violence, women's property rights, HIV and AIDS, in a variety of settings, including conflict and post-conflict contexts. Another area of her research is focused on gender, labour markets and the welfare state. And under that broad theme, she has worked on issues of older women workers' access to pensions, gendered impacts of recession and austerity, and more recently on precarious employment and older workers. She's currently exploring the impacts of COVID-19 on gender equality with a particular focus on gender-based violence and women's work participation. Thirdly, we have Dr. Eben Joseph, who is the Director of the Institute of Anti-Racism and Black Studies. Eben is a race relations consultant, and she's also the coordinator of the module in Black Studies and Critical Race Theory in Education at UCD. Eben holds the position of Career Development Consultant at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. She's also an author, a TV panellist, a columnist, chairperson of African Scholars Association in Ireland, and an equality activist. And she has published a number of books. She's a co-author of Challenging Perceptions of Africa in Schools, Critical Approaches to Global Justice Education. And her most recent book is entitled Racial Stratification in Ireland, a Critical Race Theory of Labour Market Inequality. Our final speaker is Dr. Sarah Louise Moore. Sarah Louise is a professor at Copenhagen Business School. She's also academic director of the CBS Business and Society platform, Diversity and Difference. Her research focuses on critical perspectives on managerial identity and HRM, especially in relation to issues around coping with diversity and expectations in modern, flexible ways of working. Following this broader range, she's worked with various empirical settings such as management consultancy, prisons, the military and police force, pole dancing studios, and executive networks, where she has engaged with issues such as power, culture, emotional labour, gender, ethnicity, migration, leadership, and work-life balance. Sarah's work has materialised in several published books and has also appeared in journals such as Organisation Studies, Human Relations, Organisation, Gender Work and Organisation, Culture and Organisation, as well as Leadership. So an incredible array of speakers today. I'm really excited to hear what they all have to say. Just some housekeeping before we begin. So this webinar will take about an hour. Our speakers will speak for about 8 or 9 minutes each, and after all the various presentations, we'll have Q&A and discussion for the last 20 minutes or so. Questions can be put through the Q&A function. The session is being recorded, so just to be aware of that. And finally, I'd like to thank the Whitaker Institute for all their support in organising and hosting this event, and also thank the Law School and the J.E. Cairns School of Business and Economics at NUI Galway for their support of the event also. So with all of that said, I'd like to kick off and open the session to our first speaker. And Joanne, I'm going to hand over to you, if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Lucy. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to hear what other speakers have to say and to find out what's really animating people to ask questions afterwards. So there's so much evidence of the mounting inequality impacts of COVID-19 that it's very easy to get drowned in the detail. So I want to try and focus my address to the issues that the workshop pinpoints, namely gender, work and COVID-19. So to focus specifically on the gendered impacts of COVID-19. But at the same time, it should be stressed that in understanding and addressing gender inequalities at work, it is always vital to locate one's analysis within an intersectional frame, which encompasses, for example, race, class, disability, migrant status, age, and so forth. This isn't just in order to be more inclusive, but also because in their concrete material settings, inequalities are invariably intersectionally configured. So when we're trying to respond to them, we need an intersectionality inflected response. At the same time, it is important and useful sometimes to step away from what's happening on the ground and to raise some higher level questions about the nature of the challenges we're confronting. And that's what I want to do in the short time that I have. Focusing first on the relationship between gender and work. So what is work? Work is a socially organized activity, and it serves two key purposes. It sustains us, and it makes, or certainly ought to make, our lives meaningful. Work, therefore, is central to who we are and how we live. As a socially organized activity, work is historically intertwined with systems of sex and gender differentiation. Most societies include some allocation of tasks by sex. So when we're considering the world of work, then gender features centrally. The role and operation of a gender division of labour varies from society to society and across time and place. However, within the broad parameters of Western capitalism, caring labour has almost invariably fallen upon women. So if we think of work as a life-sustaining social activity outside the contours of what we see as the job, care emerges very clearly as an important form of work, including the unpaid caring labour carried out predominantly by women in our homes and our communities. Yet, the way in which work is defined, organised and valued in our society is far more limited. It is an idea of work from which care considerations are largely excluded. The understanding is that care is something that takes place somewhere else. Care is a part of life, it's not a part of work. What a strange, contrived dichotomy that is. So let's think about the gender division of labour and where it came from. So the gender division of labour, which emerged specifically with industrialisation in Western economies, is very much a reflection of this artificial divide between work and care. With economic and policy focus very much on commodity production, social reproductive work fell to be performed by women, producing a socially engineered gender hierarchy, which, among other things, severely limited women's access to paid work and set the terms of their engagement with such work. The structural consequences of all of this are well known, but they include in particular the economic dependence of women on men, and the ideological devaluation of women's work, of care and reproductive labour. In the late 20th century, things began to change. This male breadwinner, female caregiver model began to break down, mainly because global economic restructuring demanded the entry of women in vast numbers into paid employment. Now, we could talk about why this change occurred when it did, but for the moment, I want to focus on the consequences of the mass entry of women into paid employment, specifically the way in which women's increased labour market participation strained existing arrangements for the provision of care in Western capitalist societies. Law and policymakers suddenly became concerned to facilitate the reconciliation of work and family obligations so that women could participate more freely in paid work. Feminists saw opportunities in these developments, the opportunity to lobby for greater gender equality, and the resulting legislative frameworks which emerged around discrimination, around maternity leave and so on, were undoubtedly improved as a consequence of feminist scholarship and activism. Nevertheless, and as Lucy Buckley has recently pointed out in relation to Irish law, these legal reforms did not fundamentally unsettle the gender division of labour within which the bulk of care continued to fall upon women. What the legislative framework enabled women to do was to perform both roles, to assume the double burden of work and care, which has been the experience of recent generations of working women. It also prompted the greater commodification of care work as a response to care gaps. And that created a cycle of precarity, migrant work, global care chains, and so forth. Now, there's a lot more to this story. There's the precarity of many of the jobs that women were able to access, the continued segregation of women in particular occupations, which resonated with social and cultural norms of women's work. Their presence in care, catering, hospitality, service provision, and so on. These patterns of precarity and segregation are visible in almost all developing economies, and they're deepening, not retrenching. So let's think about the impact of COVID. So it should come as no surprise to us, after all, that women workers are particularly affected by the coronavirus pandemic. They are clustered in those parts of the services sector least compatible to remote working. They're more likely to be part-time, temporary, engaged in insecure contracts, and more easily disposed when employment contracts. They populate the world of low pay and of living in poverty, and are far less likely to access digital technology or digital skills. They make up the vast majority of lone parents and therefore face unique care challenges when school and childcare providers shut down. They are in the sectors most exposed to the risk of risk of COVID, health, social care, and so on. The vulnerability and dependence of women in abusive relationships is heightened during periods of lockdown. But most importantly, there is mounting evidence to show that the new challenges in reconciling work and family responsibilities, which lockdown and COVID have brought, have fallen largely on women. In other words, in this unprecedented crisis, the gender default setting has kicked in. So what can we do? First, we can draw insight from the COVID experience by acknowledging how fragile and limited the hard-won gains for working women have been. If we're genuinely committed to gender equality, we need to change the fundamental structure of the social organisation of work and invest in particular in a care infrastructure which enables people, all people, to thrive independently. Second, we have to stop pretending that the so-called free market can make these changes for us. At the moment, markets are predicated on a very specific gender division of labour. They are also active sites of reproduction for other social hierarchies based on race, class, and increasingly age. Our economic systems are not delivering well for young people. In the last 50 years, most developed countries have witnessed growing levels of inequality. And when we take account of the increasing dependence of developed economies on exploiting the labour of workers in the developing world, the picture is bleaker still. Further concerns arise as technological advancements reduce the need for human labour, further contracting job opportunities. COVID has compelled often reluctant governments to engage in fiscal stimulation and to introduce new forms of social protection. COVID has exposed the inadequacy of our care infrastructure, and it has pinpointed exactly where our priorities should lie in recrafting a fit-for-purpose care economy. Of course, it needs courage, imagination, and political will to turn the COVID pandemic into an opportunity to rebuild our ailing societies. I'm far from confident that our current leaders can deliver what is required, but I'm hopeful about the potential contribution of young people for whom there is so much at stake in this current crisis. Increasingly, I look to them for action and for leadership. As an educator, I experience their anxiety and their frustration every day. I do what I can to empower them. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. That was a fantastic start to the webinar. And I have to say, I totally agree with you about, and I think it's very useful for us to start off with a look at this underlying structural factors that are impacting here, and the way that the system is actually set up to militate in a particular direction and exploit particular groups of people effectively by either not valuing the work they do, not paying properly, and making it impossible to come up with other solutions. I would love to share your confidence that this might be the moment where we have some impetus for change here. And that's maybe something we can explore in the discussion later on. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to our second speaker, Dr. Nata Jovery. So Nata, over to you.
All right, I'm going to use as an economist, my slides. Thank you, Professor Joan, because that was a very wonderful, broad setting of the issues. And I hope that I can now flesh out some of the empirical data around what you have said. So thank you, Lucianne, for inviting me to speak on this webinar. I'm really delighted to be here. Overall, there has been a meta-narrative that has been pointed out about whether gender equality has stalled. And much of this narrative has been based upon 4 stylized facts that we can see. First is that women are disproportionately represented in sectors that have been hit hardest by the initial response of lockdown across the globe. It's not a developing country or developed country phenomenon. This is across the globe. And women who cannot work remotely have lost jobs. And women who can work remotely have actually had a change in the hours that they work. And all women have faced increased burden of care work, which has impacted upon their productivity as well as their emotional well-being. Essential workers, particularly women in the healthcare and social care sectors, have particular challenges in negotiating care work. And women have increased experience of domestic violence. It has increased again all over the globe, and to such an extent that the UN Secretary General called it a shadow pandemic. In fact, there's a whole new discourse on COVID as a syndemic rather than a pandemic, because so many different inequalities are integrated. But interestingly, a combined impact of all these various impacts has been that there are signs of women beginning to withdraw from the labor force. We saw this huge increase in women's labor force participation, and now for the first time, we're beginning to see a decrease. And that is that women are beginning to reconsider their decision to work or seek work. And in Ireland, between January 2020 and June 2020, 71,000 women have left the labor force. Whether they're lost jobs, they have stopped seeking jobs also. Now, as we know, gender inequality often interacts with other axes of inequalities. And so I wanted to focus on migration and globalization, because migration has been a hallmark of globalization, both between countries and within countries. And in many parts of the global south, internal migration is essential for the poor to seek livelihoods, to eke out livelihoods by migrating from rural areas to urban areas, from state to state as seasonal workers. In India, the number of internal migrants last year was estimated to be about 700 million people. There has been equally a sharp increase in international migration, largely from the global south to the global north. And migrant workers account for 20% of workers in US and 17.8% of workers in Western and Northern Europe. And this migrants have a particular, COVID has impacted migrants particularly. And where we see it most strongly has been the impact on internal migrants in India. The Prime Minister of India imposed a lockdown in March 25th at midnight with very little notice to millions of workers across the country that such a policy response was being instituted. This left hundreds of millions of those internal migrants walking back hundreds of kilometers to their native villages over the subsequent months. Many were hounded by police as they were breaking the law. Hundreds died on the way, both due to hunger as well as road accidents and traffic accidents, with people running them over. And thousands were herded into relief camps. Those who have been able to get back to their villages now face a grim reality of no work, increasing poverty, and an uncertain future. One of the main drivers of international migration has been actually the demands of the global north for health and social care workers. Countries with the highest number of COVID cases are heavily dependent on foreign medical professionals. In UK, 1/3 of doctors and nurses are foreign born. And it is no surprise that in UK, 63% of the first wave of deaths of health workers were of people from Asian and Black and ethnic minorities. Migrant health workers also have, social and health workers also face increased risk of violence. UN Women 2020 report noted that healthcare workers, migrant healthcare workers were at increased risk of sexual harassment and violence from both patients' families, as well as their colleagues. And interestingly, the migrant healthcare workers also had difficulty in accessing personal protective equipment. And when they got personal protective equipment, it was inadequate because PPE is designed as being unisex, but it is designed for men's bodies. And so women didn't have proper protection even when they wore the PPE. Women migrant workers are not only concentrated in healthcare and social care, but also are quite significant share in the sectors that were affected by the crisis. As you can see, in the UK, as well as in Spain, etc., over 70–80% of sales and sales workers were women. 13% in Europe, 13% of all essential workers outside of the health and social care were immigrants, and a majority of them were women. These workers are at a greater disadvantage as they experience significant job losses and had more restrictive access to social protection. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. And then among the most vulnerable migrants are obviously women domestic workers. And among all migrant workers, there are 11.5 million domestic migrant workers spread across North America, Europe, and the Arab region. Many of these women lost their employment due to their employers' anxiety about transmission, or their employers died. And with that loss of job, either due to being fired or their employers dying, women lost income, but more importantly, their work permits became invalid. And many were trapped with closed borders in situations where they had no money, no housing, and no way out. And low-skilled labor migrants in crowded dormitories have also been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And the one data point that we have is that in Saudi Arabia, 75% of the confirmed cases of COVID on 7th of May 2020 were migrants. So there is a high spread of COVID among migrant populations. So this disproportionate burden on migrant workers has led to migrant women's workers' health being, well-being and livelihoods are disproportionately affected, and they're being predominantly excluded by governments in terms of their policy response to the crisis. They're excluded from accessing COVID-19 measures implemented by countries in which they are working. They have little access to the financial support packages, the wage subsidies, the income and social protection packages. They face burdens in terms of immigration and employment laws that limit their access to healthcare. So what are some of the immediate steps that we must take now? First is governments must expand social protection policies to include migrants. Ireland, surprisingly, is one of the few European countries that has extended the pandemic unemployment payment to migrants, legal and illegal, who have lost their jobs. The issue is how many are aware that they have this right and are availing of the benefit. But there is still a lacuna in that those in direct provision still don't have access to PUP. All migrant workers, regardless of status, need to have equal access to medical assistance and tests for COVID-19 on par with other workers. Ireland has expanded this access to migrants. But in Ireland, the issue is the test is available only if you're symptomatic, which means that if there are migrant workers who would like to go back, they would have to pay out of pocket for their COVID test. And there's a need for bilateral agreements to ensure labor protections in time of crisis. And there are clear mechanisms for the smooth repatriation of migrants. This has been one of the biggest gaps in all of the current situation, that migrants are stuck and they have no support to actually go back to their homes. So what we see is migrants are disproportionately burdened. There seems to be an increasing drive to go back, whether it's internal migrants or international migrants, to go back home. So this has some interesting consequences that we should be thinking about. What does it mean for globalization? What does COVID say about globalization and the future of globalizations? If millions of migrant workers are returning home, are we entering a new phase of closed borders? Is there a possibility that the International Division of Labor now is going to become even more virtual? And if so, what happens to that dream of the migrant that there is a pot of gold or a street of gold over there? Thank you.
Thank you, Nata. Again, a really fascinating presentation, and I'm very much struck by the discussion of the underlying structural factors that contribute to so much of this. And maybe migrant workers aren't something that a lot of us think about, you know, the issues facing migrant workers, but it's certainly shocking to see how so many of them have been treated through this pandemic. And I mean, obviously it's great to see that, I suppose it's great to see that, you know, some benefits are being extended to migrant workers in Ireland, but I also am very much aware that so many migrant workers who've been involved in care work here have been jettisoned effectively after the first wave of COVID. So again, so many issues arising here, and as you say, so many of these affect women migrants in particular. So I'm going to move now to our third speaker, Dr. Eben Joseph. And Eben, handing over to you now.
Thank you so much. And just to say a big thank you to the two speakers who've gone before me, Dr. Nita and Joanna. Again, you set the scene really, really clearly, and I would pick out, just even from where what you said, and to pick on from that, and to emphasize. And I think I love the fact that you both brought in the idea of the intersectionality. I ran a few webinars in June, July, and one of the things I talked about was the gendered face of COVID-19. How can we begin to see that face of COVID-19 as a gendered face? And so when we look at from the perspective of intersectionality and the double discrimination, women, particularly when you begin to hone in on migrant women, that they face. I guess sometimes when we hear the statistics and we hear that, migrant people are, more likely to die from the disease, or more of them are dying. I'm like, okay, you do know that it's not like if COVID-19 is running out there and saying, hey, I'm just going to look for a Black body, or I'm going to look for a migrant body and jump into their body and kill them. So it's really, how do we change that narrative? How do we phrase it in such a way that we can understand the double discrimination that is making these groups of people more susceptible to the disease? How COVID-19, what COVID-19 has done in our systems is that it has showed up the inequalities. And so you find that those who have lived on the margins of our society, those who have lived on the margins of our economy, those who have lived on the margins, socioeconomic class, so we begin to see that they are most hit. What COVID is doing, is that those people who are falling through the cracks are older generation, people who work in care, people who fall into the cracks, it has showed them up. So when we look at from that perspective of intersectionality, when we add race on top of the impact of gender, we begin to see another layer. Then we add more when we add disability to that, or when we add, their religious background to that, we begin to see more layers on it. So really, for me, is looking at key things. I think I want to try and make sure that we look at is, how do we change that narrative, that we're putting out there? At one time, they made it look almost as if, Black people lacked vitamin D, and that's why they were dying from COVID-19, and not looking at the underlying inequalities that made them more susceptible to that. When COVID, post-COVID-19, fingers crossed, now we are almost close to a vaccine. Who are those who are going to be most hit? Who are those who are going to be left, outside of the cause? I think even if we look at, just some little data quickly, just even around women. So one of the things that we see is that, the recipients of carers benefit in Ireland from our census statistics shows that, there were more women, between 2006 and 2016. between 80% and 76% of recipients of that allowance, of carers allowance, were women. Now, when we look at that and we don't look at what does that say, what is the narrative behind that, it begins to show us again and re-emphasize that the bulk of the care work is done by women. The home support work is done by women, but it also means that they are more exposed to COVID, because if they are the ones who are carers, caring, you know, if you're getting a carer's allowance, it means that you're taking care of people who are a little bit more susceptible. So it means that they are actually more exposed, you know, to some of all of these, you know. So even when we look at, you know, when we come to, you know, to our healthcare, from our census statistics, it shows us again that 91% of nurses in Ireland were women. 91%, that's a big, huge number, you know, and 84% of our healthcare workers were women. So when we begin to look at even all of those, what does it mean? You know, how does it impact? You know, so when we look at the biggest numbers of people, you know, up to about a fourth of those who are dying from COVID are within the healthcare sector, we begin to look at the exposure of women, you know, to this disease. But when we look at those who make comments, those who are in our media, those who are our TDs, those who are responding and developing ways we respond to the COVID, most of them are men. But those who are at the forefront, the receiving end of it, are mainly women. But those who are at the decision table, deciding how it's going to be treated, are men. When we look at why am I highlighting healthcare? Because we look at the level of inequality in Ireland. Because of the labor market inequality, people of migrant descent, particularly people of Black African descent, you know, most of them find it really, really difficult to navigate the labor market. So what are the two key areas where they mainly work? Healthcare and nursing. Those are the key areas. So, and you can see now that the key areas, so most of them are within that sector. And that again is the sector that is most hit, where they are most susceptible, you know, to the disease. But I keep emphasizing, we look at the TDs who are making decisions. We look at the people who come out and talk about how we're going to respond to it. Hardly, I do not see any migrant person among them deciding to say, you know, this is how the decision is going to be made. But they are working within that sector that is most hit, you know, by the disease. When we look at, you know, in the UK, you know, in the UK, Black males, Black females are, you know, even Bangladeshi, Asian, you know, workers, you know, in the healthcare, they are 4.2 to 4.3 times more likely to die from COVID. They have a higher death rate from COVID than, you know, the white, white workers in there. The first set of death, when I had a webinar a few months ago, and I put up this picture, it was so it was so disheartening to see that the first set of deaths in the UK were all Asian ethnic minority groups. You know, if we go again to the US, it's exactly the same thing. You know, the highest numbers, you know, we look at in some states in the United States, you know, while the, you know, the Black population in that state is about 35%, 75% of the deaths from COVID were Black people. Meanwhile, they are only 35% of the population, you know. So we begin to look at that. And the mistake we make in Ireland is that when we look to the US and we look to the UK and we look to France and Germany and we look at that, we think we look over there as the deaths there. But for me, when I look at it, I see a problem. The problem I see is that, number one, we do not have disaggregated data. So we are not collecting these data. Ireland cannot be different from the deaths that we are witnessing in the UK, in the US, where ethnic minority people are, you know, are dying at a higher rate or being infected at a higher rate. But we are not collecting ethnicity data when it comes to you know, this. I don't know if it has changed now, but the last time I checked, we were not collecting, you know, that data. You know, so we begin to look at, you know, that, you know, we look at also the fact that, you know, asylum seekers, people who were in Ireland seeking asylum, during, the peak of COVID, they all came out. They were all working in healthcare. But in the last 2-3 weeks, we clapped for them. We called them essential workers. But in the last 2-3 weeks, what have we done? We have again, marginalized these people, and most of them are getting deportation orders. So it's like a use and dispose. So rather than looking at them as essential workers, in fact, what our system is showing us that they are not essential workers, they are just basically essential to work. So we're going to take you, we can use you, put you in dangerous, marginalized positioning, and when we finish using you, we can dump you. Because again, and this is not new. We've done it. We did it, with Filipino nurses who came to Ireland a few years ago. So we have that history and we are reproducing that history. So what that is really saying is, when I look at the data in the UK, in the US, when I look at even the protests that came out, it was healthcare workers from ethnic minority groups who were actually leading the call, saying, witness the number of deaths. And I put my hand on my jaw when I look at Ireland. I'm like, where are our ethnic minority doctors? Where are our ethnic minority nurses? Who are there? Where are our ethnic minority healthcare workers who are suffering from these? But I think for me, it's the level of disparity that makes it even impossible for them to be able to come out and highlight their cases. In the UK, it's the Black workers, the Asian ethnic minority doctors who are coming out and saying, these are the number of deaths, this is what we are suffering, we're not getting PPE. In Ireland, it's mute, we can't hear it. Are we saying that it's not happening? I have stories and stories and stories. So for me, what this highlights is just that level of inequality, within our system. So key thing I want to talk about is, just to finish up, is to emphasize again how women are lagging behind. We look at, particularly in ethnic minority groups where we don't have grandmothers and uncles and aunties to help us here. What is happening? Young girls, when I ran a webinar, I had a young girl on, and they began to talk about the fact that a lot of the care work, looking after the younger ones, making sure that the younger ones do their homework, is now, that burden is now put on young girls in the family. And so we're looking at this inequality being increased, again. So this, I call them the hidden victims of COVID-19, these hidden victims that we're not looking at. And that's because the narrative, the people who are on the table, who are talking about it, who are reviewing it, they are not involved in these communities. These communities' voices are not on the table. So yes, we come on those webinars and we talk about how does this information go. So for me, I'm looking at how does these hidden victims of COVID-19, how do we present their cases before our TDs, who are the politicians, who are influencing the policies, who are making the decisions. Even if you look at within the academy, a piece of research came out, a few weeks ago about the fact that more men were publishing more than women, because again, most of us are taking on homework, taking that work. And so that divide, the division in the academy is increasing again. So if we have more men publishing during COVID-19, and less women publishing, not because women cannot publish, but because of the extra levels of work that they are doing. So really, there's just so much that we can talk about, looking at, migrant women, who are living in isolation, isolated within domestic issues of violence. We saw the recent death, and so it's all of those things. And I think for me, just in coming out from this, if anything can come out of this, is to make sure that these migrant groups, so what I would love to see is to make sure that these migrant groups are represented. I listen to the news every day. I never hear anything about the migrant groups. I don't hear, about marginalized people. I don't hear, that we're focusing on their issues and, to look at, things that can be done. So yeah, so just looking at how gender, race, and, and our socioeconomic backgrounds, how all of those things are intersecting, to impact on the life, that we have today. So post, at the end of COVID-19, We know already the unemployment rate of migrants, in Ireland, particularly African people, is 46. They are 5 to 8 times more likely to be unemployed. So I put my hand on my head. I'm like, oh my God. So then what's going to happen, after COVID, or, who are the first set of people who are going to be out of jobs? These same people. So what interventions really are we putting on the table? Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. That was fantastic. And I think you've highlighted so many important points there. Absolutely the need for disaggregated data. This is a really, really significant issue, but one that contributes, I think, very much to the issue of invisibility and the lack of voice, which are so important if we're going to address this crisis effectively. So, and I think a lot of us have noticed, for example, the lack of representation for women when discussing COVID and COVID-related measures, but we haven't placed so much emphasis on representation for migrant groups and other groups as well, specifically, Black workers or asylum seekers or whatever, and they're bringing so much here and are so engaged. So it's really important to hear those voices. So thank you for that. Our final speaker, and just before I come to the final speaker, just a reminder to everyone that if you have questions for our speakers at the end, we'll have a little time for questions and discussion. You could put your question in the Q&A box, please. And then our final speaker, I'm just going to hand over now to Sarah Louise. So Sarah Louise, over to you.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I am very happy to be here. I have a little disclaimer to make because I plan to talk about my research, which I'm not going to do. So my research would be addressing some of the issue that has already been talked about, but more from the work context. And also particularly, I would love to engage in a conversation about employers' responsibility in all of this. But I decided yesterday that I would talk about my activism instead, because I was recently involved in a slightly delayed Me Too wave here in Denmark. And particularly, I was running the Me Too wave in academia, where we collected signatures and also stories from academics about both sexual harassment and sexism. And the reason why I want to switch to this topic is that we have begun to talk about how COVID actually shaped that, both positively and negatively. And I think I'll end on a more positive note, talking also about the solidarity and the communities that COVID-19 is also, I think, nurturing in this also crisis. So I want to, go back about a month or a month and a half, where the Me Too wave in Denmark started with a comedian who on stage told a story, and for some reason it was the perfect timing. And it, for the first time in the last couple of years, where we've talked more about, or tried to talk more about sexual harassment, it gained voice. And you said, Lucienne, you said it's about also giving voice. And I think in retrospective, thinking about, why was it possible at this point in time? And we have talked about since in the circles here that it was because of COVID, actually, that it was more possible for us. It was, in a sense, less vulnerable to stand up and to tell your stories. It was less vulnerable to put your signature in a petition. We had some online communities, but we were not going back to work. So we're not going back to the workplaces that we were, protesting against, that we were resisting. So we have really thought about also what kind of voice, even though we were in our homes, most of us, but what kind of voice it gave us, that we did not have to face our colleagues basically at work. So within 4 days, we got 900 stories and 700 signatures from Danish academia. And I will mind you that Denmark has a population of 5 million. So it is a very, it's a large number in so few days. We had a lot of people who had never dared to speak out before, who spoke out. I also had a lot of contact with people who still couldn't tell their story, openly, but was supporting the case. We experienced a completely different sense of community, particularly among women, because we already had a debate going on how difficult COVID was on women in the first place. So I think the feminist communities, in a sense, were attuned to a different care for each other. You also, I think, Joanne, it was you who talked about care. So I also felt a completely different care in this vulnerability all of us was feeling at this point. And maybe it is my attempt, as some would say, I'm the eternal optimist, to also try to look at some of the positive things that came out of this. When that is said, I also have to say some of the more negative things that came out of this, particularly the vulnerability that many women who had to go to work were facing after this. And this feeds into both precarity that I think both Natha and Joanne were talking about. It also feeds into who were privileged enough to have a workspace at home, who needed to go to work. So in Denmark, the situation is right now that we can go to work if we have to. My internet is very bad at home, so I'm at work today actually because of this, but usually I'm at home. So I'm also privileged enough to actually be able to have some kind of workspace at home. So it's very much about the precarious workers, the workers with small children, the workers with smaller homes that would need to go to work, which also meant that after signing, because there was a lot of hostility around the fact that we signed, particularly in very male-dominated parts of academia. The stories that came out were horrifying in many ways and shocking our managements that they had the degree of sexual violence as they did. So the problem was also that in the most hostile of these environments, it was also easier target in a sense if you had to come to work as a precarious worker. Because one of the things that really came out of this was exactly the precarity of particularly university hired people. So the amount of years it takes before you have a permanent position, it is the same in all countries. It's not different in our country, even though we praise ourselves to be a welfare state, which also means we do not face, at least on the paper, some of the same levels as, for example, UK and US. We can talk about that later if anyone wants to do that. I spent half of COVID time in US and half in Denmark. Certainly a huge difference. But one of the things that I wanted to say here is that some of the things that I think are very, very problematic, and some of the problematic aspects that COVID emphasized for us as university workers was definitely the power structures in our universities, how we rely often on informal power structures, so not necessarily management power structures, but informal relationships with people who will get us the next job, the next position, take us on board the next project, etc. So majority of our stories were exactly this, which is then increased during COVID. It also really linked to this put emphasis on the precarious workers that we have. But I do also want to say that I do feel, and I think this seminar is actually also a sign of that, that we also have new access to feminist communities, feminist solidarity, which is both across borders. I don't think we would have done this physically. I'm not sure we would have done a webinar like this if COVID wouldn't have been here. So again, being the eternal optimist here, I can see that the communities, the online communities that we were also able to create very, very quickly during this Me Too wave. And particularly also now we're trying to work on ways we can also build support structures for our younger researchers, so the precarious researchers, to build, you know, not economic, of course, structures, but at least our care and our solidarity with them, and try to help each other through this crisis, but also through moments of resistance, which definitely this Me Too wave have been to us. So I was recently, reading the recent book by Butler and colleagues about vulnerability and resistance, and it just kind of sits with me that it's not only, you know, we don't only resist through vulnerability, we also have vulnerability in resistance. And I think that kind of double loop between vulnerability and resistance is also very beautiful, and is a moment that definitely has, or COVID has been something that definitely has made it more present, but also more necessary that we can do this and that we can resist together in these communities. So on a very positive note, or a somewhat more positive note, I really would like to also for us to talk about, you know, how can we also change things through these communities and through these networks and through this resistance that we also, that I feel that COVID has also brought to us in a way.
So thank you very much, Sarah Louise. That was really interesting and a very, I think, different presentation to the others, but it's really great to see that, you know, maybe something positive might be coming out. But I suppose it's also interesting, though, that you've highlighted that maybe this has created spaces where new kinds of engagement can happen, and that's fantastic. But you've also highlighted these underlying structural things that can make things very, very difficult to engage with. And I think also it's striking too that you've emphasized that although these new spaces are being created, in a way, who can avail of those spaces is still a matter of privilege. And we are still talking about some groups not potentially being able to avail of those opportunities. So I guess some really important insights there for us, and perhaps we might all start to think then about whether COVID is creating some new opportunities. And maybe I think some of our other speakers as well have highlighted ways where COVID is starting to open up spaces where there might be at that moment when we could, you know, engage with policy agendas to, in a new way or in a more effective way, or where we can point to concrete instances where we can engage with policymakers. So at this point, I'm going to open up to questions, and we have a number of questions coming in here in the chat, and I'll just remind all our speakers, if you wouldn't mind just putting on your videos or whatever, so that we can all engage with these. So we have a question here that someone would be very interested to hear comments on a recent research from TCD and other universities that women leaders had approximately 60% less COVID-19 casualties compared with male leaders due to policies adopted. Any thoughts on that? For example, Ireland versus New Zealand is one possibility. Would any of our speakers like to come in on that? Is it a bit left field, perhaps? Sarah Louise?
I've been asked that question several times by news reporters, so I can try. I would really not like to go back to it's because women, per definition, because of our bodies, are more nurturing, because that's also a very stereotypical view of women. Mm-hmm. I lean towards many different explanations, but I think one of the main explanations is, and we know that from leadership theory as well, that women just need to be better in order to reach top positions. So they need to do, be able to have both, soft skills and hard skills, and they need to just perform better. So we also have different theories saying that if women fail, they just fail more, they fall deeper. So my theory would be that women are just women leaders. And I'm not going to essentialize here, but I think that during their career, they're just much more attuned to both reacting to what is going on, because they're punished quickly in their career. So I don't think they will reach that level if they're not able to engage in a very different way. So I think it has much more to do with how the career is formed due to social stereotypes or constructed stereotypes around what a good leader is. A male leader can make many more mistakes and make it to the top. I think it's more that than going back to a kind of a natural argument around that we per definition are better leaders, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah, I would like to just chime in because I think, yes, absolutely true. It's nothing to do about whether we're better carers or it's naturally our role. But I think what is important to think about is what was the nature of those policies? It's the nature of policies that were implemented in some of these countries where COVID deaths were less than the policies in countries where COVID deaths were higher. And that's a critical issue. We should never forget the larger social structure and policy making and not reduce it. It's a danger that we tend to reduce everything to female bodies are doing better.
Very good. Joanne or Eben, would either of you have any thoughts on this, or will we just move on to another question? Okay, so some really interesting questions coming in here. And there's a question here about feminist solidarity in academia and how to build networks of support and care in an ambience of productivism, competition, and neoliberal functioning. Any thoughts, anyone here on this one?
I mean, I don't know so much about all this, jargon things. For me, the simplicity of life is that as a Black academic, as a Black scholar, I'm an activist, I'm out there, and I think I suffer the brunt of that, because when you speak out, there is a penalty you pay for speaking out, and I know I paid that price. But I guess for me, it's always important that, at the end of it all, when I'm being put in that box and I'm ready to leave this world, what is important to me, So you have to choose. So I have chosen the path that I want to be on. But when we talk about, feminist solidarity, so that's why most times when I hear about feminism, I'm like, stop, you're talking about white feminists, white feminists, is it talking about white women's issues? So I have a lot of issues when I hear feminists, so I'm like, are you talking about white women, because it's my case. Part of what you're talking about is people that look like me. Are they part of the issues? So when we talk about that system, that solidarity, where you're in a department, where the curriculum is still very white, or all the professors and all the staff are still very white, and you're a Black or you're a white scholar in there and you're comfortable with it, and you're not doing anything, then you're complicit. You're part of my problem. You're not just part of my problem, but you're part of the problem of people who look like me and those who are coming after me. So when we talk about this solidarity and this activism, so if we cannot see it in the academy, it's the same thing that I'm talking about in the media. We're talking about COVID-19. The people who are out there, they are either male, even if there's a female, is white as well, but the people who are at the bottom of the ladder, the traveler or the Roma or the African, they are not there. Their voices are not there. The unique situations, they are blamed for their marginality. So yes, I think there's a massive room for us to not be in competition. There is enough space for all of us. When we shouldn't be in competition, we should be in solidarity with each other and fight from the same corner. So when we say women, we should make sure the women with disability or different abilities, the women, of different ethnicities should be part of that struggle.
Absolutely.
I answered your question, sorry.
Yeah, no, that is so true. And I think, feminism is nowhere unless it is an inclusive and intersectional feminism. And in terms of building academic solidarity, we need to bear that in mind. Joanne, you want to come in on this one?
Well, I do think we need to acknowledge the difficulties with building academic solidarity in a higher education system that is deeply competitive. What's the words? Competitive, neoliberal. And I mean, I've been in academia for 35 years, and it's just transformed beyond recognition what was a vocational a vocational occupation, which you saw yourself as a public servant, effectively providing a public good, is now become totally marketized. You're in a business, you are subject to a whole set of regulatory and disciplining mechanisms for the good of the business. Your relationship with the students has undergone fundamental change. It's a consumer relationship now, and that makes actually education extraordinarily difficult. So I think we are in extremely challenging times, even before COVID, for trying to build any kind of solidarity. But what I think, and insofar as you can do things locally and even on an individual level, and of course you can, but it's no substitute for also operating at other levels. I think that I try to practice ways of being in academia that are against the sort of values and norms and standards which are constantly pushed upon us. And so I see solidarity, kindness, care, support, resisting competitiveness, all as ways in which we can kind of performatively resist the neoliberalization of the academy. And I also think that as an older member of staff who's on their way to, you know, to walking away from higher education, having had a much better time there than some of the young people coming in, I feel a certain amount of freedom to be able to provide that support without fear of anybody acting against me, because I can always walk away from it. So that's what I try and do.
Right, very good. And Sarah Louise?
Yeah, so first of all, of course, I speak from a completely different context where education is, first of all, free. So it's not, you know, commercialized in the same way. Obviously, there are still, you know, socioeconomic issues and stuff like that. But when that is said, we do have a different competitive environment. Of course, it's competitive, but not even close to the way that you're experiencing it. But when that is said, I will just agree with you on the last point, because for me, I mean, you're right, but activism, feminist activism and solidarity for me is also two interlinked but different things. So my feminist activist practice in my work, that is in my own curriculum, that is in the study boards, that is, you know, when we hire people, that isn't, you know, but that's different from the academic solidarity that I feel we can create. My academic solidarity is, for example, in this Me Too, you know, thing that we did, because a lot of the other senior women, they didn't even dare to start the initiative because they were afraid of losing their jobs. And what you know, we were 16 women across various disciplines, and we looked each other in the eye and we said, I'm ready to walk away from my work. I'm ready to just leave my job because of this, because this is more important. So I think for me, solidarity is also to be willing to risk that. And for me, solidarity, and that's maybe combined with feminist activism, is also that we have a responsibility when we have a fixed, a permanent position to do something about it. So that is, you know, my personal take on this. I don't even see it as a choice, because if I don't do this, I'm not able to, you know, be in my work. So if I could not do this, because then I would rather leave my work, if that makes sense.
Sure, sure. Natalie, did you have any thoughts on this one? Or... Sorry, you're muted there.
Yeah. I mean, solidarity, I would agree with what both Joanne has said and what Louise has now just said. I think it's very much important about understanding that you have the ability to take a risk, that there are certain things that are of value, that are of higher value than any other project that you're involved in. And that without that, there can be no real solidarity. I mean, that's the first principle for solidarity.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're I've gone over time a little bit, so maybe just one question more, and this could be, there's an interesting one coming here, that what one or more change to the tax system, but for Joanne especially, it could also be a change to the legal system perhaps. What change would you like to see to help to deal with the inequalities or discrimination that you spoke about? Is tax policy part of the problem, or indeed other legal policy, is that part of the problem? And for that in particular, what about the implications for women and pensions? So who might like to go first on this one? Any particular policy change, tax policy or other policy that you think would be really important in helping to address the issues we've looked at today? Nata.
Well, it's not necessarily a tax policy, but I think we do have to think about universal basic income. Mm-hmm. It's not about working with a little fiddling around with tax system for some incentives, etc. It's really, there has to be a firm commitment that there is a basic minimum income, and that therefore that is the foundation. Without that foundation, I don't think we're going to be able to address some of the inequalities and discrimination. Second thing that I do want to say is the way the welfare system, especially in Ireland, is constructed. It's full of loopholes, and it's fragmented. It's not comprehensive. So for the PUP payment, older workers were denied the PUP payment because they have a pension payment. A pension payment which was in fact lower than the PUP payment, which many older workers were working because their pensions were inadequate. And so this whole concept of you can't double dip is total nonsense. And it has no understanding about what, again, is the minimum that is required to live a life of dignity. That's very important. Second, I just want to flag, I think COVID-19 and the potential it has on women's work participation. Yes, the data is early, but 71,000 women have left the labor force. They are not seeking work. And that was about 6% of the 2019 last quarter employment figures. And that's significant. And if women are leaving the workforce, then this has significant implications, again, for what they can accumulate in terms of pensions. And it has significant implications for economic security in the older age. So COVID-19, is it a new marriage bar?
Yeah, very thought-provoking. So who's going to, Joanne, you're waiting to come in next, I think, are you?
Well, I can sort of address the legal issue. So first of all, I completely endorse everything that Nat has said. I mean, for me, the bottom line is that COVID has shown that the legal kind of framework we've put in place for facilitating the reconciliation of work and family responsibilities for eliminating discrimination works reasonably well, not brilliantly, but it works okay in a context where things are going well and employment is increasing and jobs aren't contracting. But once you have a crisis, and this happened with the 2008 crisis as well, women and other vulnerable marginal groups in the labour market are the first to feel the brunt of it. And that tells me that something much more structural is needed. And it might be different depending on what kind of precarity and what category of difference you're talking about. But I think in terms of the fundamental issue, I think for women is the development of a care infrastructure. Nancy Fraser says that instead of having an assumption that the worker is unencumbered and the care takes place somewhere else, let's assume that all workers are also caregivers. So adopt a universal caregiver model and therefore design the social organization of work and the legal structure that supports it around the assumption that all workers also provide care or at various times in need of care. And I think just seeing that as a kind of different way of trying to reimagine the world of work as a starting point, and it would certainly involve taxes and it would certainly involve pensions. Okay, thanks.
Super, thanks. And Sarah Louise?
Yeah, so I really like the way you say, Nada, is COVID the new marriage bar? Because that's actually one of the things that that we are beginning to see in the data that we have collected, the interview data we have collected from COVID started. It is yes, women are definitely the ones taking most of the home chores, but one of the reasons for that is also the way the workplaces react, because the workplaces, the managers are much more willing to let a female employee take that responsibility, whereas a manager is very not likely at all to make a male employee take that responsibility. And this is also where I also, am arguing for men's rights in some of this, because much of our interview data also shows that, it's simply not an accepted reason in the same way for a woman if it's, family responsibility. So I think it's also one of the reasons that we see many women falling out of the workforce during COVID is not necessarily their own choice. So again, it's not necessarily the individual choice, but it also happens within the family where other structural and cultural issues is making that decision, for them, or at least forming that decision, or at least in heterosexual relationships, of course.
Super. Eben, any thoughts on this question?
I think that, again, every time I hear women, I'm like, okay, are migrant women in there? I'm always, whenever I hear an analysis, I'm always wondering, are migrant women's issues there? Are you remembering the intersectionality? Really, really important, because when you say women, my work, also shows that, the hierarchy, that operates there. So when you look at, the impact on women, or even the numbers of women who have left work, I would really love to see what percentage of them are migrant people? What percentage of them come from a lower socioeconomic background? Because think about it, COVID, many of us, we went out saying we're all in this together. But when the deaths began to come in, we realized that actually, no, we're not all in this together. The most marginalized are they are simply on your own. Like when you say, guys, you're on your own, COVID showed us that, what? The lower down the pecking order you are strictly on your own. So key things that we want to, for me, that, of course, it will involve policy change, it would involve tax changes, but looking at the fact that, particularly women and people of migrant descent, women of migrant descent, they are primary carers, the only carer. I'm the only carer of my 2 boys in Ireland now. So I've had to reduce my hours. Why? Because I'm like, okay, I need to be alive to mind these kids, even some of the things, that takes you, into more dangerous. I'm privileged in that I'm able to work from home in my kind of work. But most of the people I know from my background that are parenting alone, their jobs are the kind of jobs where they are facing customers, and so that means that they are constantly at risk. So when you calculate the risk, and then you calculate that you are the only primary carer, you're the only carer of your child or the people that you have, you calculate you're even at the low end of the income bar, you're earning literally close to nothing, and so you look at the risk of yourself. The easiest thing is, to keep safe and mind family, and all of those things. So yes, I think that if we had, maybe like a basic income, then people are able to make better choices. Then people are able to have options. It's about giving people options. People like particularly marginalized people, women of ethnic minorities at the bottom of the ladder, they have literally no options. And I think that, for me, that would be somewhere to start from.
Okay, thank you all. Now, we've kind of gone over time at this stage. We still have great questions coming in, but I think we're going to have to call a halt for it. But I would like to thank all our speakers again. It's been an absolutely fascinating session, and thank our audience as well, both for coming and for contributing through the questions that you have posed. And just thank you, everyone. And this was just such a great discussion with everybody. So I guess we'll leave it at that then.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again.
Lovely meeting all of you.